Everyone in the restaurant saw an old man who looked out of place, but only one woman saw someone worth greeting. Harold Kang stepped through the revolving glass doors of Manhattan's most exclusive steakhouse at exactly 6:17 p.m. The evening crowd barely noticed him. Those who did took only a brief glance before looking away. In a dining room filled with tailored suits, designer dresses, and conversations about investments, real estate, and private schools, the elderly man seemed almost invisible. His gray jacket was neatly pressed but old. His shoes had been polished carefully, though the leather showed years of wear. He carried no entourage, no luxury watch, no obvious sign of wealth. To most people, he looked like a retired grandfather who had wandered into a place where he didn't belong. The hostess offered a professional smile before quickly turning her attention to a younger couple entering behind him. A busboy hurried past without making eye contact. Two businessmen waiting near the bar glanced at Harold and then continued their conversation as though he wasn't standing there at all. Harold simply nodded to himself. It wasn't the first time. At 79 years old, he had learned that aging came with a strange kind of disappearance. People stopped seeing you. They looked through you instead. He quietly moved toward a small bench near the entrance and sat down, folding his hands in his lap. Around him, glasses clinked softly beneath golden chandeliers. The scent of grilled steak and fresh bread drifted through the air. Laughter echoed from the private dining rooms. Yet somehow, despite being surrounded by hundreds of people, Harold looked completely alone. Across the restaurant floor, Vanessa Carter balanced a tray of drinks while weaving through crowded tables. At 27 years old, she had mastered the art of noticing things other people missed. Maybe it came from years of working double shifts. Maybe it came from growing up in neighborhoods where paying attention mattered. Or maybe it came from something deeper. Whatever the reason, her eyes found the elderly man almost immediately. She noticed the way he sat patiently while others were ignored. She noticed the way he smiled politely whenever staff rushed past him without acknowledgement. Most of all, she noticed the sadness hidden behind his calm expression. Something about it tugged at her heart. A manager brushed past Harold without stopping. Another employee walked directly in front of him as if he wasn't there. Vanessa slowed her pace. The old man remained seated, waiting quietly, never complaining, never demanding attention. For reasons she couldn't explain, she placed her tray onto a nearby service station and walked toward him. As she approached, Harold looked up with mild surprise. Few people had spoken to him since he'd entered. Vanessa offered a warm smile. Then she did something no one in that restaurant expected. She bowed her head respectfully and spoke in flawless Korean. Annyeonghaseyo, Sien Sengnam. Welcome. It's an honor to have you here. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Harold's eyes widened. The noise of the restaurant faded into the background. His lips parted slightly as if he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. The young black waitress standing before him had just greeted him in the language of his childhood with the respect reserved for someone truly valued. And as emotion suddenly filled his eyes, something extraordinary happened. The old man who had been invisible only seconds earlier began to cry. The tears appeared so suddenly that even Harold seemed surprised by them. He lowered his gaze for a moment and removed a neatly folded handkerchief from his jacket pocket. Around them, the restaurant continued moving as if nothing unusual had happened. Yet Vanessa sensed something important had just occurred. She had spoken only a few words, but those words seemed to carry a weight far greater than a simple greeting. "Forgive me," Harold said softly in Korean. His voice carried the gentle warmth of someone who had spent decades speaking carefully. "I did not expect to hear my language tonight." Vanessa's smile softened. "My grandmother used to tell me that people never forget how they are greeted," she replied in Korean, "especially when they feel alone." Harold looked at her for a long moment. The surprise in his eyes slowly transformed into curiosity. "You speak beautifully," he said. "Where did you learn?" Before Vanessa could answer, a nearby server nearly stopped walking when he heard the unfamiliar language flowing between them. Another employee glanced over. Then another. Within moments, several staff members were quietly watching from a distance. Nobody understood what was being said, but they understood enough to realize that the conversation was unusual. Vanessa noticed the attention and tried not to let it distract her. "I lived in Seoul for several years," she explained. "A family there helped me when I was young. They treated me like their own daughter." Harold's expression changed immediately. The lines around his eyes deepened with emotion. Seoul, he repeated. Most Americans cannot even pronounce the city correctly, yet you speak like someone who belongs there. Vanessa laughed softly. I made many mistakes when I first arrived. People were very patient with me. For the first time since entering the restaurant, Harold laughed as well. It was a quiet sound, but genuine. The kind of laughter that comes from an old memory unexpectedly returning after years of silence. Across the dining room, the hostess who had ignored him earlier noticed the change. So did the manager. The old man who had seemed invisible only minutes ago was suddenly the center of attention, though nobody understood why. Harold folded his hands and studied Vanessa carefully. Do you know what surprises me most? He asked. It is not your Korean. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. What is it then? Harold glanced around the restaurant. Everyone else looked at me and saw an old man waiting alone. You looked at me and saw someone worth speaking to. The words landed heavily between them. Vanessa did not know how to respond. She simply offered a small smile, because the truth was that she understood exactly what he meant. She had spent much of her life being underestimated herself. People often saw her uniform before they saw her intelligence. They noticed her job before they noticed her character. The silence that followed felt comfortable rather than awkward. Then Harold asked a question that immediately caught her off guard. Tell me, Vanessa Carter, he said in Korean. What was the name of the family who took care of you in Seoul? Vanessa blinked. Few people ever asked that question. The memories felt distant now, almost dreamlike. Yet she answered honestly. The moment the name left her lips, the color drained from Harold's face. His eyes widened. His fingers tightened around the handkerchief resting in his lap. For several seconds, he simply stared at her. And in that instant, Vanessa realized she had just said something far more important than she understood. Harold Kang looked as though the ground beneath him had shifted. The bustling restaurant, the conversations, the soft music drifting through hidden speakers all seemed to disappear from his awareness. Only Vanessa remained in focus. She watched confusion and recognition battle across his face. What is wrong? She asked gently in Korean. Harold swallowed before speaking. The family you mentioned, he said slowly. The Park family. Are you telling me it was Min Jae Park and his wife, Sunny? Vanessa's eyes widened. You knew them? Harold leaned back against the bench as if suddenly overwhelmed by memories. For several moments he did not answer. His gaze drifted toward the chandelier hanging above the dining room. But it was clear he was looking far beyond New York. Far beyond the present. Knew them, he finally whispered. Min Jae Park was my closest friend for more than 40 years. Vanessa felt her heart skip. She had not heard that name spoken aloud in years. To her, Min Jae Park had been more than a guardian. He had been the man who taught her how to ride a bicycle through narrow Seoul streets. The man who patiently corrected her Korean pronunciation every evening at the dinner table. The man who told her that respect was not measured by status, but by how you treated people who could offer you nothing in return. Harold's eyes glistened. I attended his wedding. I held his first son when he was born. We celebrated every new year together for decades. His voice trembled slightly. Then life became busy. Business responsibilities grew. We spoke less often. Years passed. And before I realized it, too much time had slipped away. Vanessa sat quietly beside him. She understood that kind of regret. Some distances were measured in miles. Others were measured in missed opportunities. He spoke about a friend named Harold, she said softly. Many times. Harold looked at her immediately. He did. Vanessa nodded. Whenever he told stories about his younger days, your name always came up. He said you were stubborn, competitive, and impossible to beat at chess. For the first time, genuine laughter escaped Harold's lips. The sound carried warmth through the air. Several nearby employees glanced over again, unable to understand why the elderly guest who had arrived alone now appeared transformed. That sounds exactly like him, Harold said. He never let me win a single game. The laughter faded, replaced by a quieter emotion. How long did you live with them? He asked. Almost 6 years, Vanessa replied. After my mother passed away, opportunities brought me to Seoul. They opened their home to me when they had no reason to. They treated me like family. Harold lowered his eyes. That sounds exactly like Min Jae. A silence settled between them. Not an uncomfortable silence, but one filled with shared memories belonging to people separated by continents and generations. Then Harold asked a question so quietly that Vanessa almost missed it. Do you know what happened after they moved away from Seoul? Vanessa shook her head. No, We lost contact years ago. Harold stared at the floor. The emotion returned to his face. And suddenly Vanessa understood that whatever answer he carried was about to change everything she thought she knew. Harold remained silent for so long that Vanessa wondered if he had changed his mind. The sounds of the restaurant slowly returned around them. Plates clinked. Servers moved between tables. A pianist near the lounge area played a soft melody that drifted through the warm evening air. Yet neither of them seemed aware of any of it. Finally, Harold drew a slow breath. "The Parks never told you?" he asked quietly. Vanessa shook her head. "After I returned to America, we exchanged letters for a while. Then life became busy. Eventually the letters stopped coming. I always assumed they moved somewhere else." Harold lowered his gaze. They did move, but not because they wanted to. Vanessa felt her stomach tighten. Something in his voice warned her that the story ahead would not be simple. Harold carefully folded and unfolded the handkerchief in his hands. Min-jae devoted much of his life to helping people. It did not matter whether they were family, neighbors, or complete strangers. If someone needed support, he gave it. Sometimes he gave more than he could afford. Vanessa smiled faintly. That sounded exactly like the man she remembered. Harold returned the smile, but sadness quickly replaced it. "Several years after you left Seoul, his health began to decline. He never complained. He never asked anyone for sympathy. Even when things became difficult, he spent more time worrying about others than himself." Vanessa's eyes softened. "That sounds like him too." Harold nodded. "One day I visited him. We sat together for hours. We talked about old memories. We talked about family. And then he surprised me." Harold paused. "He told me about an American girl who had entered his life and changed his understanding of kindness." Vanessa blinked. "Me? You?" Harold's voice carried certainty. He said that after years of helping people, he finally understood what it felt like to receive kindness in return. He spoke about your determination, your respect, the way you worked harder than anyone around you. He said you reminded him that gratitude still existed in the world. Vanessa looked away, suddenly overwhelmed. She had never imagined that a family who had done so much for her might have remembered her with such affection. Harold continued. "Before I left that day, he gave me something." Slowly, Harold reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. Vanessa watched as he removed a small, worn envelope. The paper showed signs of age. The corners were softened from years of careful handling. Harold stared at it for a moment before offering it to her. "He asked me to keep this safe." Vanessa accepted the envelope with trembling fingers. Written across the front, in neat Korean handwriting she instantly recognized, were 3 words that made her heart stop. To Vanessa. For a moment she could not breathe. She knew that handwriting. She had seen it on birthday cards, school notes, and encouraging messages left beside her breakfast plate years ago. The world seemed to blur around her. "I never opened it," Harold said softly. "It was meant for you." Vanessa stared at the envelope as emotions she had buried for years rushed back all at once. Then, before she could gather herself, a sudden movement near the restaurant entrance caused conversations throughout the dining room to fade. Heads began turning toward the front doors. Staff members straightened instantly. The atmosphere changed in a way Vanessa could not explain. And when Harold slowly looked up, a complicated expression crossed his face. Because the person who had just entered the restaurant was someone he knew better than anyone else in the world. The man who entered the restaurant did not raise his voice. He did not demand attention. Yet attention followed him anyway. Conversation slowed. Servers instinctively stepped aside. Even the manager who had barely noticed Harold earlier straightened his posture and hurried toward the entrance. Vanessa watched from across the dining room, still holding the unopened envelope in her hands. She immediately understood that this newcomer carried a presence unlike anyone else in the room. Ethan Kang moved with calm confidence, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that seemed understated compared to the luxury surrounding him. At 38 years old, he looked younger than many expected, but there was something in his eyes that made people pay attention. He acknowledged a few staff members with brief nods before scanning the room. Then his gaze landed on Harold. For a moment, relief appeared on his face. Then confusion followed. Because Harold was smiling, Ethan slowed his pace. Anyone who knew him well understood how unusual that detail was. His father rarely smiled in public anymore. Yet there he sat, speaking animatedly with a waitress. Ethan approached their table and stopped. "Father," he said in Korean, "I have been looking for you." Harold looked up and chuckled softly. You finally arrived. Ethan's eyes shifted toward Vanessa. He studied her carefully, not rudely, not dismissively, simply trying to understand what he was seeing. And who is this? He asked. Before Harold could answer, Vanessa stood respectfully. My name is Vanessa Carter, sir. Ethan gave a polite nod. Then something unexpected happened. Without warning, he switched into an older form of Korean. The words were formal, elegant, and rarely heard outside academic circles or traditional ceremonies. Miss Carter, he said calmly, may I ask where you learned to speak Korean? Vanessa blinked. She immediately recognized the linguistic shift. Most people would not have noticed the difference. Yet she answered in the same formal style. I was fortunate to learn from people who respected tradition. Ethan's expression remained neutral. And do you still remember the customs associated with that tradition? Vanessa replied without hesitation. Respect for elders. Humility before knowledge. Gratitude before success. Harold's smile widened. Ethan remained silent. Then he asked another question. This time the wording became even more complex. Vanessa understood every word. She answered just as naturally. Nearby employees watched in complete confusion. None of them understood the conversation, but they could see something changing. Ethan's posture shifted slightly. The careful distance in his eyes began to fade. Interesting, he said. Very interesting. Harold laughed openly now. I told you she was remarkable. Ethan looked back at his father. You have not spoken this much in weeks. The room seemed to grow quieter. Harold's expression softened. That is because nobody has spoken to me like this in weeks. Ethan followed his father's gaze toward Vanessa. For the first time, he noticed the envelope resting carefully in her hands. He noticed the emotion in his father's eyes. He noticed something else as well. His father looked happy, genuinely happy. It was such a rare sight that Ethan found himself momentarily speechless. Then Harold made a statement that caught them both by surprise. Ethan, he said quietly, this young woman knew how to see me before she knew who I was. And for reasons he could not fully explain, those words stayed with Ethan far longer than anything else he heard that night. Vanessa lowered her eyes to the envelope resting in her hands. The worn paper suddenly felt heavier than before. Around them, the restaurant continued its elegant rhythm, but at their table a different story was unfolding. Ethan took a seat beside his father, his attention now fully focused on the young waitress who seemed connected to a chapter of their lives neither man had expected to revisit. Harold nodded toward the envelope. You should open it. Vanessa hesitated. Part of her wanted to preserve the mystery a little longer. Another part feared what she might discover inside. Slowly, she slipped a finger beneath the seal. The paper crackled softly. Inside was a handwritten letter and a faded photograph. The moment she saw the photograph, her breath caught. It showed a much younger Min-jae Park standing beside another man. Both were smiling broadly. One arm rested across the other's shoulder. Vanessa immediately recognized Min-jae. Then she looked at the second man. Her eyes widened. The second man was Harold. Decades younger, but unmistakably Harold. That picture was taken almost 30 years ago, Harold said quietly. Vanessa turned her attention to the letter. The familiar handwriting brought tears to her eyes before she even began reading. Min-jae's words were simple. He wrote about gratitude. He wrote about family. He wrote about how proud he was of the young woman Vanessa was becoming. Then one passage made her stop. She read it twice to make sure she understood. If you are reading this, it means life has reunited paths that were never meant to stay separated. Trust Harold Kang. He is one of the few people whose character remained unchanged through every season of life. Vanessa looked up slowly. Harold's eyes had become glassy. Ethan remained silent. There is more, Harold said. Vanessa continued reading. The next paragraph revealed something she had never known. Years earlier, when Vanessa had first arrived in Seoul frightened and alone, Min-jae had not made the decision to help her by himself. Before opening his home, he had called someone he trusted for advice. That person had been Harold. Vanessa stared at the words in disbelief. You knew about me? She asked. Harold nodded. From the very beginning. Ethan looked surprised. You never told me that. Harold smiled faintly. Because it was never my story to tell. Vanessa felt emotions colliding inside her. For years she had believed her journey to Korea was shaped by coincidence. Yet now she was discovering invisible threads connecting people across continents and decades. Harold leaned forward slightly. There is something else you should know. His voice grew softer. Min-jae often said that kindness travels farther than money, status, or influence. He believed every act of respect creates a chain reaction that continues long after we are gone. Harold glanced around the restaurant. Tonight, I think he would be smiling. Vanessa followed his gaze. For the first time, she noticed how many people were watching. The manager, the hostess, several servers. People who had overlooked Harold earlier now seemed unable to look away. None of them understood the history being revealed. Yet somehow they sensed they were witnessing something important. And as Ethan quietly studied Vanessa, he found himself wondering whether this meeting had been an accident at all, or whether some promises made many years ago had finally come home. The longer Ethan sat there, the more curious he became. Throughout his life, he had watched people react to influence, wealth, and reputation. He had seen strangers become friendly the moment they learned a name. He had seen respect appear only after status was revealed. Yet Vanessa had done something entirely different. She had offered kindness before knowing any of those things. That detail lingered in his mind. Harold seemed to sense his son's thoughts. "Do you understand now?" he asked quietly in Korean. Ethan looked at his father. "Understand what?" Harold smiled. "Why I stayed." Ethan glanced toward Vanessa. She had returned to standing beside the table, still holding the letter carefully. "Most people spend their lives trying to be noticed," Harold continued. Tonight, she noticed someone else. Vanessa lowered her eyes, embarrassed by the attention. "I only said hello." Harold laughed softly. "No, you did much more than that." For a moment, none of them spoke. Then Ethan surprised both of them. "When was the last time you visited Korea?" he asked Vanessa. She thought about the question. "Almost 10 years ago." "Do you still keep the traditions?" Ethan asked. "As best as I can." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then tell me something." His tone was thoughtful rather than challenging now. "What is the most important lesson you learned there?" Vanessa did not answer immediately. She looked down at the old photograph resting beside the letter. Then she remembered countless evenings sitting at a small kitchen table in Seoul while Min-jae Park shared stories about life. "Respect is not something you give to important people," she finally said. "It is something you give because you are an honorable person." Harold closed his eyes briefly. The answer clearly touched him. Ethan remained silent. Around them, several employees had drifted closer under the excuse of working nearby. Even the manager seemed unable to stop watching. Vanessa continued. "Min-jae always said that character is revealed by how you treat people who cannot improve your situation." Harold opened his eyes and smiled. "That sounds exactly like him." Ethan leaned back in his chair. For the first time that evening, he found himself remembering lessons his own father had taught him decades earlier. Lessons he had not thought about in years. The strange thing was that hearing them from Vanessa somehow made them feel new again. Then a server approached nervously and informed Ethan that a private dining room had been prepared for him. The manager himself appeared seconds later, eager to provide the highest level of service. Ethan listened politely. Then he looked at his father. Harold glanced at Vanessa. "I am comfortable right here," he said. The manager seemed surprised. Ethan noticed the reaction immediately. So did Harold. The irony was impossible to miss. Earlier, nobody wanted to offer the old man a table. Now everyone wanted to impress him. The realization settled over the room like a quiet lesson. And as Ethan observed the sudden change in people's behavior, he began seeing the entire evening through a different lens. Not through the eyes of a powerful man. Through the eyes of an elderly father who had walked into a crowded restaurant and become invisible until one waitress chose to see him. The atmosphere inside the restaurant had changed completely. Earlier that evening, Harold had sat unnoticed near the entrance while people hurried past him without a second glance. Now managers, hosts, and servers seemed eager to anticipate his every need. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Vanessa noticed it too. She watched as the same hostess who had overlooked Harold approached with a warm smile and offered to move him to a premium table near the windows. Another employee appeared with complimentary desserts. The manager personally recommended special menu items. Everyone suddenly wanted to help. Harold accepted their kindness politely, but there was a sadness behind his smile. He had lived long enough to recognize the difference between genuine respect and attention that arrived too late. Ethan noticed it as well. He sat quietly for a moment before standing from his chair. His movement immediately caught the attention of nearby staff members. The manager stepped forward, eager to assist. "Mr. Kang, If there is anything at all we can do for your father tonight, please let us know. Ethan looked around the room. His expression remained calm, but his words carried weight. There was something you could have done. The manager's smile faded slightly. Ethan continued. You could have greeted him when he walked in. The words were not spoken with anger. That somehow made them more powerful. The manager lowered his eyes. Around them, several employees suddenly looked uncomfortable. Ethan glanced toward his father. My father does not need special treatment. Then he looked toward Vanessa. He needed what she gave him. The room fell unusually quiet. Vanessa felt every eye turn toward her. She immediately wished they would not. Recognition had never been something she sought. She simply believed people deserved basic respect. Harold smiled warmly at her. That is exactly why it mattered. The manager took a slow breath before turning toward Harold. Sir, I owe you an apology. His voice was sincere now. I should have welcomed you the moment you arrived. Harold studied him for a moment. Then he nodded. Thank you. No lecture followed. No humiliation. No dramatic confrontation. Just a simple acknowledgement of a mistake. Somehow that made the moment even more meaningful. One by one, other employees approached as well. The hostess apologized. A young server admitted he should have offered assistance. Even the busboy who had rushed past Harold earlier stopped to introduce himself properly. Vanessa watched in amazement. She had expected embarrassment. Instead, she was witnessing something much rarer. People choosing humility. Ethan returned to his seat beside his father. You were right, he said quietly. Harold raised an eyebrow. About what? Ethan glanced toward Vanessa. Character reveals itself long before titles do. Harold smiled. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Ethan looked around the dining room one final time. Everyone seemed calmer now. The tension had disappeared. In its place was something else. Understanding. And as Vanessa carefully folded Minjae's letter and placed it back into the envelope, she realized that the most important thing that happened that evening had nothing to do with wealth, influence, or status. It began with a greeting, and somehow that greeting had reminded an entire room what respect actually looked like. The evening slowly drew to a close, but nobody seemed eager to leave. Something meaningful had settled over the restaurant, something far more valuable than the expensive meals and elegant surroundings. Harold sat quietly with the envelope beside him, occasionally glancing at the photograph of his old friend. Years of memories seemed to move behind his eyes. For the first time since arriving, he no longer looked lonely. Vanessa stood nearby, preparing to return to her duties, when Harold motioned for her to come closer. She stepped toward the table. Harold carefully folded the photograph and placed it back inside the envelope. Then he looked at her with the same warmth Minjae Park had once carried. There is one last thing I want you to know, he said softly in Korean. Vanessa listened. My friend believed that people enter our lives for a reason. Some stay for years. Some stay for only a moment. But the good ones leave something behind. Vanessa felt emotion tighten in her throat. Harold smiled. You left something behind tonight. Ethan watched the exchange quietly. The words touched him more than he expected. Throughout his life, he had attended meetings with influential people, spoken with leaders, and sat across from individuals whose names carried weight in every room they entered. Yet none of those conversations felt as important as the one unfolding before him now. Because this one was real. Harold slowly reached out and took Vanessa's hand between both of his. The gesture was simple, almost grandfatherly. You reminded an old man that he was still seen. The dining room seemed to fall silent once again, not because anyone had demanded attention, but because sincerity has a way of commanding its own respect. Vanessa blinked back tears. I only treated you the way my family taught me to treat people. Harold nodded. Exactly. Ethan stood from his chair and looked at Vanessa. Most people wait until they learn who someone is before deciding how much respect to give them. His gaze shifted briefly toward the room around them. You decided first. Vanessa did not know what to say. She had never imagined that a simple greeting would lead to any of this. The manager approached one final time, not to impress anyone, but simply to thank Harold for his grace and Vanessa for the example she had set. Others quietly did the same. No one seemed concerned with status anymore. The lessons of the evening had become impossible to ignore. As Harold prepared to leave, he paused near the entrance where he had once sat alone. He turned back toward Vanessa. His eyes shone with quiet emotion. Then, in Korean, he spoke words that she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. The world becomes better whenever someone chooses kindness before judgment. Vanessa bowed respectfully. Harold returned the gesture. Ethan opened the door for his father, and together they stepped into the Manhattan night. For a moment, Harold looked happier than he had in years. Ethan noticed it too. As they disappeared into the city lights, Vanessa held the envelope close to her heart. She had arrived at work expecting an ordinary shift. Instead, she had rediscovered a piece of her past, reunited two stories separated by decades, and reminded an entire room of something easy to forget. And that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.